Welcome, hotshots, to Flashlight by Firepower X. Here you can find the industrial strength tools you need to dominate your personal and professional wellness as a firefighter. My name is Jess. I'm the creator of Firepower X and your host for today's webinar. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's special guest, Ms. Melissa Rossback. With a human resources journey that began in 2002, she evolved from private sector training and development to independent consulting, and then learned the ins and outs of the public sector while continuing to earn advanced degrees. And most recently, she's launched her own consultancy, the MiXx Consulting, with an important mission: bridging the gap between organizations and their people, because one cannot successfully exist without the other. And she's currently pursuing her doctorate degree, and in her free time enjoys Spartan races, golf, reading, and life with two exceptional children, Jillian and Daltrey. Melissa, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yes. And I think the last time I had you in the spotlight was at our conference in 2023, which feels like a million years ago now. What's your relationship to the fire service?
It started back in 2017. I guess I was introduced to it when my 2-year-old son jumped into the fire chief's rig and flipped on all the lights and sirens, and he was just obsessed with fire trucks and all things fire. So introduced me to the world of fire, and then I ended up taking over a position in 2017 at South Adams County Fire, and worked there for 8 years. Learned all about the public sector, and it was extremely enjoyable, and decided recently to go out on my own. So now I consult for public sector and private sector as well, but the majority of my clients right now are public sector.
What was your biggest takeaway during that time, that 8 years with South Adams County, for HR as it relates to the fire service?
Really and truly how important it is to act as a liaison between the employees and the organization. Human resources in the fire service, in any public or private entity, has a dual responsibility: one, to protect the employees and to make sure that they're offering programs and tools that they can use to be successful, but also to protect the organization from lack of compliance or statute issues or any legal landmines that they might find themselves stepping on. So I think that the biggest thing was really how many hats most fire folks wear, because they are smaller agencies a lot of times, and especially the ones that are kind of in between small, medium, where they're growing, but most employees are a single department, so they wear several hats and help each other out. So kind of a multitasking approach, and collaboration was huge in the fire service. So I did take a lot away from that.
I think we have all these preconceived notions about HR, especially coming in as firefighters, of like, I'm in trouble if I get called into HR. Like, what are some of the myths and preconceptions you want to clear up for our viewers right now about interfacing with their HR department?
HR has certainly been a dirty word for many people. And I think really, it's really developing the relationship and bridging the gap of what they assume to be true and what is actually human resources. And a lot of times discipline is synonymous with human resources. And really and truly, it's just establishing what the parameters look like, and then allowing the employees to freely flow within those parameters. And it's a difficult message to completely convey, because you can say it in every language that you're able to speak, and until they actually are able to experience it, sometimes it just doesn't completely resonate with them. It's an interesting position.
I feel like there's some stories behind that giggle that you could tell us. How does leadership then, how do you pull it into kind of the triangle of the employee, the organization, HR? Where does leadership fit into this?
The leadership team supporting human resources is huge, because they're speaking on behalf of the employees. And a lot of them have grown up through the fire service and have been promoted into the rank that they're currently in. So the executive leadership team and human resources really do work hand in hand. And I love how one of my counterparts put it recently. They eliminated the human resources traditional role and adopted more of a human resources business partner, because a consultant, it really is a lot more beneficial right now because I can consult them. They make the decisions. Human resources typically does, and it's the fire chief and the executive leadership team. So you just give them the information and allow them to work within the parameters of the statutes.
Mhm.
And of course, with special districts, Title 32 is huge, but there are ever-changing statutes that leadership has to be apprised of, and that's where human resources does come in. But also, it really has to do with the personality of the leader and what their innate traits are or what their leadership style looks like. And sometimes that leadership style is fluid throughout their career, but typically their personality style or traits stay fairly consistent. Personal versus professional obviously are different, but that also goes back to their personality traits. If they fluctuate who they are at home versus professional world, it's probably because of their personality style. Mine stays the same. I'm the same at home as I am at work.
How did you get interested in personality traits and leadership?
Back in the private sector, I was a corporate trainer for a large restaurant company and trained all of their managers that came through. But we got heavily involved in DISC training, which is a personality assessment, and there's 1,000 of them. There's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and Myers-Briggs is a popular one. Most people have heard of Myers-Briggs. DISC is a personal favorite because it's relatable and it doesn't lock someone into a certain box. There combination. So a D personality is very dominant, but it doesn't mean that they're overbearing necessarily. It just means that they're very direct and they've got a dominant personality. It's just they're a little bit considered harsh, I guess. I started exploring different personality assessments and I actually was certified to teach them.
Mhm.
So when I started with South Adams, there were a couple of concerns that some of the leaders had with some of their employees. And so I was able to test all the employees there. And not to create perfect teams, but really to appreciate that everybody is different. You might have a D personality and an S personality, but I might have the same characteristics, but my steady personality might be higher than my dominant personality, or vice versa. So the combination and just the appreciation and the respect for who someone is based on what their personality looks like, and the fact that you might be speaking a certain language and they might be receiving it a completely different way.
Did that help you like mediate situations between like supervisor and employee, or were you giving more insight to like the supervisor on how to interact with employee?
I think it was a little bit of both. At first, they were afraid that we were going to switch up their teams and try to create perfect teams, and that doesn't exist, right?
Mhm.
It's just a mutual respect is going to create a better team. We had some leaders that would come and say, my lieutenant or my firefighter, they're not responding to the orders that I'm giving them, or they think that I'm being mean, or they think I'm creating a hostile work environment. That's a buzzword that gets thrown around and it's like, oh, stop. But explaining what their personality looks like and then getting them together to have a conversation and get on the same page. And sometimes it worked great, but again, it's that personality type and whether or not they can be introspective enough to say, you know what, I'm going down a dark path right now. So I'm going to reel that in and I'm going to understand where you're coming from. Let's try a few things. And they really do need to explore and kind of see what works. Do emails work better for you? Do you prefer a text? Do you prefer I command you to go do this right now? It really depends on the employee is receiving the instruction and if they can get on the same page.
I'm not as familiar with DISC as I am with Myers-Briggs. I did some research quickly before we got on this interview. And it seems very simple because there's only 4 quadrants. Do you find, because I know you're familiar with Myers-Briggs as well, like going from 16 kind of more fixed personality types to 4, you said it was DISC is a little more flexible. Do you find it's a little more like reductionist too, where it's like, well, I don't quite fit in one of these 4 quadrants? What have you found comparing those two?
So with Myers-Briggs, there is a school of thought that you are one or the other. You are an E or you're an I. And my own testing debunked that right off the bat because I tested the same as an extrovert and an introvert. I'm an introverted extrovert.
Mm-hmm.
Really. I can hang out with people and be social, but then I need that time to regroup. So I think that the misconception about Myers-Briggs is that you are one or the other, period, and it never changes. It does change over time through experiences, environmental influences, whatever it might be. But with DISC, what I love about DISC is that you have, so D stands for dominant. I is that interpersonal, introspective. S is very steady, and C's are conscientious. So you have your basic four quadrants, but there's the blend. So then when you take the assessment, your graph tells you which blend you most likely resonate with. When I would test employees, I would say, listen, it's not a foolproof test. I'm going to read your descriptions. And where I always found that they were like, oh, no, that's not me at all, was when we get to the part where it says things you could improve upon. So they're all like, oh, no, that's not me, which sometimes are like, oh, dead on. But it is not foolproof. I could get really down in the weeds with employees if we had the kind of money to do that, but most agencies don't. So I think that for me, I liked the fact that you can fit into a quadrant and some of the characteristics will match that employee, but then some don't. But it's something to be cognizant of, because if you have a personality that's very prone to holding a grudge or maybe narcissism or something like that, and that's a very broad and direct evil term. If you know that you are inclined to certain personality types, then it's just something that the leader can be cognizant of.
And having that information, does that make leadership easy? Or it sounds like it's still a little bit of a trial and error when relating to an employee.
I think sometimes it makes it easier because you can say, you can almost diffuse a conversation before it starts. Listen, I'm going to speak to you on your level. I know that this is your personality, but if I get to a point where I'm crossing a line, let's talk about that before you become defensive. Because once the walls go up, then it's not a productive conversation anymore, and you should shut it down and circle back later on. Depending on how advanced the leader is, sometimes they get thrown into leadership positions and they're not ready for it. And they might be the first person to say, I didn't want that. I didn't want to be a lieutenant, or I didn't want to be a captain, but we had no one else that would do it. So here I am. And so do the agencies give that leader the ability to grow into that role, thrown into the fire, no pun intended, or actually pun intended, but also at the same time, guide them into a solid leadership role? That it makes it a little bit more challenging for leaders, because now, and knowledge is power. And so now you know more than you cared to know, and you have to navigate the gazillion different personality types.
Do people who are of opposite ends of the disc get along better, or is it people who are more similar? How did the dynamics actually play out in terms of the relationship?
So it depends. I'll just use myself as an example because it's a little bit easier for me to relate. And another employee who tested the same as I did. I'm a D and a C, and my D and C tested the same across the board. So my I and S are very low. So dominant and conscientious. So the way that I usually describe it is that, Dawn, we ride. And then my C personality is like, well, wait, hang on a second. Let's just think this through. It's that yin yang. It works really well. But then the other employee that had the exact same test tested just a little bit lower on the C level, so a little bit less conscientious. We got along well, but there were things that we had to agree to disagree on. Where we should have seen eye to eye, we had to go, okay, well, that's your perspective, and we're just going to roll forward. So I think that there's just a very slight variance in someone's graph could make a huge difference as to whether or not they see eye to eye on more things than not.
Have you ever used these personality types for like your personal life and your personal relationships, or with your children? Have you tried to identify what they are, and just out of curiosity?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of our employees would bring their spouses in to have me test them. I tested some children as well, but I've been studying behavior for so long that I typically know someone's personality before I test them. And so it's a kind of a game with myself to see how correct I was. So I'm like, all right, let's put you to the test. I think you're so smart. With my children and my significant other, it's very interesting to see what their challenges are. And when I speak a certain language to them and they don't get it, I'm like, oh, that's right. Different personality.
Now, I want to hear more about this superpower of knowing what other people's personality types are before you test them. Are there markers? Are there like behavioral markers you notice in people? They're like, oh yeah, that's a dominant trait, or things like that?
The way that someone speaks is very telling. Their body language is very telling. If you think about, and we learned this back in public speaking, I think when I was in college, and don't ask me how long ago that was, because that'd be rude. But sometimes a more introverted person, and this might go back to more to the Myers-Briggs, but S personalities are a little bit more introverted typically because they don't have that emotional swing. So people who cross their arms are a little bit standoffish. It would tell that they're a little bit more introverted.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it's not foolproof. It never
Mm-hmm.
is. There's always that unicorn that's like, that's not me. So yeah, there are certain tells. And quiet individuals typically are either S's or C's, because a C personality will think about everything that someone's saying before they respond. So they'll actually take the time to process it. And sometimes they're quick to respond because they can process at a different rate than other people. A lot of times they're just like, hang on, give me a minute. The ones that are at dawn we ride, they're the ones that they've got an answer for everything.
I'm starting to realize through the course of this conversation that I probably got a lot of D. I'm sure you've already figured that out about me. Cool. So when it comes to having difficult conversations, if you know someone is fundamentally, personality-wise, very different from you, and you're about to gear up for a very difficult conversation with them, what are some different strategies of doing that?
A lot of times I ask questions. So it's really, I can tell them what they were probably thinking, and I'm probably wrong. But if you try to get into someone's head and you try to speak for them or you try to assume for them, it puts them defensive typically right off the bat. Like if an employee were to come in and they did something very egregious, help me understand what your thought process was before that happened, and letting them articulate what actually took place and then trying to disseminate what they actually mean is really tricky, because they could say, well, I mean, it was a busy day and I wasn't really thinking, and I had just come to shift and it was 7 o'clock in the morning and I had just gotten in a fight with my significant other, whatever. So really trying to peel back the onion, I guess you could say, to see what the root cause was for why they actually did what they did. So you've heard the seek first to understand and then be understood. So seeking first to understand, asking those questions and really trying to understand where that employee was coming from. I think that helps in a lot of situations. And there are some times when the disciplinary process is a lot less intense because you've actually listened to the employee and they're like, well, that's how it happened. And this is what happened before that. And then it changes the trajectory of the conversation.
Yeah. And it gives you so much more insight about who they are as a person, of their thought process, because you can start to see the patterns that they follow. Do you have any other tricks to make difficult conversations at work or home easier?
It does depend on a personality. I keep going back to that because it is so influential. But I really think that going into it with almost diffusing the situation before the conversation even starts. There are some opening phrases like, hey, something's really been weighing on my brain or my heart, and I really need to maybe talk about this, but I'd really like to just engage in conversation. I'm not upset, but I was. And so I feel like in order for us to move past this, I just really need to banter back and forth, where it's not a talking to, it's a talking with. So you're engaging in conversation. You want to hear what the other person has to say because you really need to let it go. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard for people to let it go. It's really easy for people to say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, let it go. But for a conscientious brain, it's analysis paralysis, and you're sitting there and the wheels are turning and they don't stop until you get it all sorted out. So it depends on the personality. Some people are just able to let it go. I personalities are often able to let it go a lot faster because they're more about the person and the emotion, and no, we feel good together, so everything's great. But not a C personality. Like, talk about beating a dead horse with a stick. That conversational piece and just opening it up and diffusing it before it gets started is impactful.
Framing the conversation. The word choice, even when we say we have a problem, or versus how you nicely put it. This is something I myself am learning as I get more mature, because younger me would have just went straight on to, I'm so mad at you. We got to talk about this and it's your fault. How did your fascination with personality types grow into then organizational leadership?
I'm an observer. So in a huge group, it's likely that I'm on the sidelines watching. I just find it intriguing. It's not that I'm doing it to pick somebody apart. It's just very interesting, the combination of personalities and how people interact. I find it very amazing. Through some leaders that I've worked with, I started to notice different traits. And then when I started my doctoral program, so my doctorate's going to be in organizational leadership, I never knew that narcissism and Machiavellianism and psychopathy were all part of a dark triad of leadership types. And I didn't even know that phrase existed until recently. So I started digging a little bit deeper into that. But I wanted to know if there was a combination of traits that fundamentally makes for a better leader. Or is there a combination of traits that lead to kind of dark leadership? Or is there a combination that's somewhere in the middle where you could go either way? That's where it really happened. So I started to become aware of dark leadership traits, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let's read more about it. I do believe that someone's innate need, so by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you figure out what makes you tick. What's the one thing that you will fight to the death for? And that's your innate need. So obviously there's an assessment, because why wouldn't there be? And then your personality type, I like DISC naturally, and then your leadership trait, which would be defined from an MLQ assessment. So all of those combined, are they predisposed to positive leadership or negative leadership? I think that this is where if someone knows who they are, they can act and respond much more confidently than if they are just like, I don't know why I respond that way. If you know why you respond a certain way, then you can also mitigate some of the pitfalls that you might start to encounter. If you know that your immediate reaction to any conflict is to place blame, then okay, I might have some narcissistic tendencies there. So I'm just gonna stop that dead in its tracks, and I'm gonna try to approach it from this angle. Okay, help me understand why you feel that way about me. There are certain things that you can learn through the process. I'm actually working on developing a leadership program right now where healthy conversations could come out of it instead of being defensive. But it's that security, I believe, that really allows someone to say, no, I believe this to be correct and right. Please give me a compelling reason why I should take your perspective and consider it. Because if you're confident enough that you know that you're right and somebody else is challenging that, then please, let's have that conversation. That should be interesting. Let's go. Yeah, I know that was a winded answer to your question.
Oh, you're fine. We like wind here. I've never heard of the MLQ as far as your leadership trait, you said. Can you just give us some examples of what these traits are?
Yeah. So it's a multi-factor leadership questionnaire is what MLQ stands for. And that one really is, so there's a transformational leader, and transformational leaders are really about ethics and morals, and that's their guiding force, I guess you could say. A transactional leader is more like, no, this is you do for me and I'll do for you. That one's very tricky, and that from an HR perspective, that one resonates with quid pro quo sometimes, not on the same level, but it's more of a, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. But servant leadership is another one that's huge. Servant leadership is very prominent in the fire service. I've worked with several leaders. A servant leader is really all about the employee, not the organization, but they are supporting and serving the employee in an effort for the employee to do right by the organization. So their way around it is just different. I love servant leaders because they really have the employee's best interest at heart. Now, could an entire leadership team be successful as servant leaders? Maybe and maybe not. But I believe in a healthy combination, to be honest. So yes, and there's laissez-faire, and there's all sorts of different leadership types that we could get into. I don't have great examples of every single one of them.
So it's essentially your strategy for leading, like what your primary relational strategy is. That's interesting. Yeah, then I'm sure that trifecta of knowing that and then what your personality type is can really help you be self-aware of what you're doing. Do you have any cautionary tales for the ego? And I know we talked offline about getting your ego in place when you are leading, and the hard look that when you do get these scores, like what if it is something that's leaning towards the darker side? How do we handle stuff like that?
Any person in a position of leadership has a responsibility to hold themselves in check. If someone's ego gets too large, that is, so in the private sector, we had a success syndrome theory, and it was basically when you have some successes, you're so busy patting yourself on the back and your competition passes you by. For leaders in the fire service, there's never a great time to pat yourself on the back. You should be patting your employees on the back, always giving them accolades, because intrinsically, when you give gratitude and appreciation, you get it right back. So knowing that there's that push pull and capitalizing on that. If you go down a path where you're constantly like, I did this, I did that, me, and I don't get enough recognition because I did all these great things for these people and I'm not getting awards and I'm not getting recognized and I'm not this or that. That's a dangerous path to go down because then it becomes about you and not the people that you serve. Because innately, the fire service serves a community. The support staff serves those who serve the community. It's this balance, or there should be a balance. If that level of protection ceases to exist, then the employees are all vulnerable. And the leadership team, they're the ones that are supposed to provide that protection for the employees to make sure that they're conveying the right message or the wrong message. Depending on what message they are conveying, that's what the employees are going to believe. And it's really important for the leadership team to drop their egos and to really hold themselves accountable to the successful execution of organizational tasks.
Now, I know you said you've seen a lot of servant leadership in the fire service. Did you see any other larger trends that seem to be prevalent in terms of personality type or leader strategies, or even things that worked really well and things that didn't work well that you could illuminate us with?
Well, yes and no. My role as HR, a lot of that's confidential, but I can talk to or speak to. There are some traits or some situations where some of the leaders are so politically bound that depending on what their experience looks like, it might create a culture of duplicity where they want things to be a certain way, but then they are politically bound to accommodate the needs of the board and the needs of the union. And then you've got some of the other civilian employees that are just like, well, wait a minute, this isn't how the private sector did it. There's not enough training for civilians to mold into a successful existence yet into the fire service. It just takes time. For the leaders, they have a very challenging role. Yeah, I do not envy their position at all because they have to play both sides of the fence. And sometimes if they are not firm and solid on their position, they can get swayed. A lot of times there'll be an agreement in this office, in this room, but in this meeting and in this room, what was just established is now changed. Sometimes that communication doesn't go back and forth. That's a challenge. And I don't know if there's a great way to resolve that except for the continuation of that development of relationships to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, I would also like to extend some gratitude to the command staff because they do have a lot of sometimes conflicting parties to juggle in their job. In my younger days in the fire service, I used to really judge the chief. He or she is supposed to be here for us. And now in learning more about just the complexities of all these contending factors, I'm like, wow, yeah. How do you keep everybody happy and also keep yourself sane? Because that at the end of the day is also important for them too. Did you find a difference as far as testing men versus women in the fire service of their personality types, or was there like an equal representation of dominant women, introverted men? Was it a smattering of everything?
So the way that actually first started was I couldn't figure out the personality of the leadership team. So I thought like attracts like. So I've got to figure out who the founding fathers of this organization were and why they now attracted so many different personalities. Or is there one dominant trait that was attracted because of who the leadership team was. And the most dominant trait is the I personality. And the I personality tends to be more about service and community and people and really engaging on a emotionally intimate level, if that makes sense. So like really heartfelt service, and that these guys put their lives on the line and they serve the community to the end sometimes. I think the I personality was the most dominant. That was not surprising. I did find it surprising that I was one of the first D personalities to come in.
Really?
There with solid D. So depending on where you are on the graph determines how dominant you are. There were D personalities, but they had a lower D. So there's a threshold on discs. I call it the gray area. So you can test in that gray area, which makes you a strong or a weak letter. So you might be a strong D or a weak D based on where you are in that gray threshold. But mine was clear off the chart. And so that was the first one that I had seen, which was very weird and ironic. But in terms of men versus women, I don't know that there was a difference in their dominant traits. Most of them were just I personalities and not very many dominant women. Now, except for the chief that was hired the same day as I was. She had a very, very dominant personality, but we had different secondary traits. So my secondary trait was a C and her secondary, I think, was an I, but a lower I. The gender thing's different. It'll be interesting to keep track of that stuff moving forward.
Just speaking as a woman, having been in the fire service, most women going into the fire service, I would think an adaptation would be like having this dominant side, just because you would have to. I found myself having to have that to set boundaries and to just be like, I can do this. So I would be curious to see if there had been any studies on it.
Well, keep in mind too, when I tested these folks, that was in their onboarding, which would be in their very first day of that organization. So whether they had previous experience or not might have affected those scores. But I will say that there is an overshift pattern in DISC where if you answer the way you think that the proctor wants to hear, it'll overshift it. So there's an overshift, which is all in the top quadrant, or an undershift, which is all in the bottom quadrant. And if you test over or under, then that means that you didn't test it right, test again. And I will say that more men tested in the over or undershift patterns, probably because I don't know this for a fact, I'm hypothesizing, but I'm guessing that maybe it's because they didn't really want to be honest about what that personality looks like, or fear of maybe, I don't know, a retaliatory response, which isn't the test, but they don't really know that when they first get tested. That would be my take.
Yeah. No, I can see how the factor of having someone else in the room administering it would definitely change the dynamic a little bit of like, how do I want to be perceived versus how I actually am on the inside, which is all a game we're all playing every day.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because there are actually 3 different graphs in DISC. And the first one is how I want others to see me. The middle one is how I am under stress. And then the last one is my basic personality. So there are 3 different graphs that are displayed. But when someone's an undershift or an overshift, it's on all 3. So there's no getting away from it. Try again.
That's good to know.
Also with HR, it depends on how used to HR they are. I was the very first human resources professional that developed the HR department. So they weren't used to human resources. They had an administrative assistant who did the HR function, but there's a vast difference between someone who gets thrown to the wolves and someone who's been formally educated.
Exactly. And it's just a different dynamic. Is there anything else we haven't touched on today that you feel is important for firefighters to hear in this whole arena of personality, leadership, communication?
Honestly, I would say that I would highly encourage everyone to find out what their personality looks like and then find out what traits they don't appreciate about their personality and really try to educate themselves. There's a lot of trainings. Stephen Covey has, it's back in the 80s, but it's still very relevant to today, that he has 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and it's an amazing series. Simon Sinek has a ton of books out there that will help you understand how to grow as a leader. But I think that the second a leader stops trying to be better is when they start to get into some dangerous waters.
That's a good piece, a good caveat to leave us with. Kaizen, a little bit better every day. That's one of my mottos. I always like to leave our viewers with one tool or resource, and you've mentioned two great ones. I love both of those authors. So what would you recommend for people who want to continue the thread of this conversation and learn a little bit more?
They can always go to my website and join the newsletter. I do a monthly newsletter right now. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of one-off series depending on what leadership series I might be working on at that time. I always give HR tips and tricks. And these are great also for leaders of organizations who might not be able to afford human resources, because they'll approach whatever might be coming down the pike from statutes or laws. But anyway, if they sign up for the newsletter, they'll receive that monthly.
Excellent. It's nice to have someone watching out for that legal stuff, because boy, it can change pretty fast and suddenly be different. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. It was a lovely conversation. I learned a lot. I enjoyed all of your insights today. Thank you for coming on the show. Really appreciate having you. And a big thank you to our community members. If you are still watching at this point, you're amazing. We appreciate you. And as always, my door is open. If you have any feedback for us or just want to drop me a line, my email again is info@firepowerx.com. And friends, we will see you in the next webinar. Bye for now.